Today we're back with our HDRI node setup file. The reason we initially made this HDR node setup is because we wanted more realism in our textures, and we managed to achieve that by using HDR image and the lighting from it. So we're going to go a step further than that today, because apart from the lighting, we're going to be talking about the shadows, in particular, to start off with anyway, the ground shadows. Okay, now if I was to hide this plane, which is the wrong one, is that one, you see we're not projecting any ground shadows anywhere. This background image purely is an image. It's not receiving any information from the models. So if I was to enable the plane again, and let me just mute this background there so it's not so distracting, we're looking at how we will be able to bake these shadows. Now if I mute this texture with node wrangler, if you want to mute a node so it doesn't appear, it doesn't work, just simply highlight the node and press the M key. Okay, so we've got this white background on the plane. So we're looking at these shadows. If I was to bake these shadows, what we get is we get a baked image with all this white in it, as well as the dark area where the shadows are. But if we're going to use these shadows on a ground plane in Second Life, we want it with alpha. Now the general consensus is you cannot bake alpha with cycles, and this is pretty much true, but we can work around it. Most people will tell you to simply go to the Blender render and start to bake that way, in the bake the transparencies in the Blender render engine. It's not a solution I'm particularly fond of, because often you've got to set up your lighting and your materials again. So we're going to do it a different way. So what we're looking at a way to bake these shadows with a transparent background on the image. So let me first of all go into a solid view. Alright, it's going to be quicker to work with this way because I'm not waiting on it rendering all the time. And while we're here, let me just get rid of these this image setup here, and this is purely projecting that grid pattern onto the plane. So if I go into a render view here, you'll see it would just be a white plane, and we want to bake these shadows. I haven't touched anything else. My lighting, my materials, everything else is all the same for the other objects. Right, so really the first thing I want to do, I want to make sure that this plane is unwrapped. So let me bring up an image editor here, and if I edit the plane, I'm just double checking it, yes, it is unwrapped. Right, I'm going to leave this in edit mode, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to back into render mode, because I want to see where these shadows are catching, and I want to adjust my plane to catch the shadows, but be as small as possible. Okay, that way I maximize the texture area. Okay, so if I just select these two vertices and I grab them on what will be the x-axis, so GX, and I'll just bring those in. So it's still catching the shadow there. I can do the same with these two. And I'm doing this in render view because I'm able then to see how much I need to resize these. So let me grab these two. So that'll be on the y-axis, GY. Let me just spin around a little. Okay, my shadows aren't going to change position by spinning around because my sun is going to be in the same place relative to the models. So that'll be on the y-axis again. So GY, bring those in. Right, so now I should be able to catch both these shadows on this texture space. So I'll just go back into solid view and let me go into an object mode. So I've deleted the grid material or the grid texture here. So I've got my basic diffuse and material output. I don't need glossy on this. I don't want glossy on it. It could be adding more to it than what we actually need. Okay, but this is basically ready to bake. So what I'll do is I'll create a new texture and I'll call it I don't know, two-part shadow. Okay. We can have alpha on it or not. It doesn't really matter because we're going to be doing some work afterwards. So I'll just leave it there for the moment. And we've got this two-part shadow. Now if I was to go ahead and bake this, where we're going? We're going down here, bake. What's my samples at? 128, that'll do for now. If I was to go ahead and bake this, just a combined texture, we'll bake. No active image found. I didn't add the image here. Okay, that's fine. Shift A, add a texture and an image texture, and find my two-part shadow. There we go. This highlighted, and we'll bake again. Okay, I'm going to pause while that's baking. Okay, that's baked, and we can see the bake down here on the new image we created. So now what we need to do is we need to find a way to turn all this white into an alpha channel. I know the image already has an alpha channel because that's the way we specified it, but it's not transparent. So we need to use this white to make a transparency mask. Okay, the way we're going to do this is we're actually going to, let me just expand this out a little. We're actually going to use the node compositor. Okay, so if we come to our node editor, we know this is an object in this as well, but if we come to the first group of buttons, the first one is the object or the shader. The second one is a compositor. So we'll click that and we get this new node set up. Okay, let's delete these and we'll set up a slightly different type of setup here. Sorry, I was just moving something out of the way on my other screen. Right, we want to ensure that use nodes is checked. Okay, and then we're going to add a couple of nodes here. First of all, we're going to add an input, and we want an image. Okay, so we'll bring this up here. We should have in our stack our two-part shadow, and there it is. And we're also going to need to add an output, which will be a viewer node. Okay, so that's there. And if I connect the image into the viewer node and I do a backdrop here, you can see our image is on the back. But we're not interested in the image as such, but we are for the minute. What I'm noticing is there's a lot of a blue tint or hue on this, and this is due to the HDRI sky being blue. So I probably want to kind of convert this to black and white and get rid of this blue, just have black and white colors in it. And let's see, color, and I think I'll do that with a hue saturation value. Will that work? Let's desaturate it. There we go. Bring the value down a bit. We'll make it darker. No. The hue. No, we'll leave that at 0.5. Anyway, we desaturated it to a black and white. Right. Desaturation basically means taking all the color information out, and it's not black and white, it's grayscale really. Okay, so let's see what else is here we can use. A color ramp under converter. So we put a color ramp in, And what I want to do is I want to bring the black values up and the white values. Actually, the white is pretty much white, so just bring black values up a little bit. Okay, it's looking a bit grainy here because I only baked at 128 samples. If you bake at a higher sample rate, it'll look a lot better. Right, so now we've got this black and white or this grayscale image, and we somehow want to remove the white from it. Okay, so we can do that. An inverter node, we can make the white black, but that'll make the black white again. So let's just bring up an inverter node. So that would be under converter, I think. No, it may be under color. Invert, yeah. So let's bring this invert node in, and you see it's made the black white and white black. This is pretty good for what we want. Right, now the thing is, we're using it on the image here. Okay, we don't want to use it on the image because we're not using the color information. We're looking for the alpha information, making an alpha mask where black is invisible and white is seen. So let's unplug this from the image and plug it into the alpha channel. Now you see we've got a shadow here. Okay, and we've got no background, which is exactly what we were looking for. Okay, so how can we use this image? Well, we can come back to UV image editor, and we should now see a viewer node in here, and there it is. You see our image? It's got black and it's got transparency. That's exactly what we were looking for. We could go ahead and save this image. Let's do that actually. Let's call it two-part. Save it with an alpha and as a PNG. Never save as a bitmap or a JPEG, but I almost always work in PNG anyway. So we'll save it as a PNG. Right. Now, let's go back to our node editor and let's put a texture setup here. So Control T onto the diffuse. Our viewer node is active there, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to load up the two-part image that we just saved. Okay. Right. If we come back now to a 3D view or to a rendered view, you'll see that this is looking all black. And the reason for this is because we don't have any transparent shader on this plane. So I'm going to add one. Okay, so Shift A, add a shader, add a transparent shader. I'm going to move this across, and I'm going to add a mix shader to mix these together. So Shift A and a mix shader. Okay, and I'm going to plug the transparency into the top of the mix shader. Okay, so now you see this is semi-transparent. Now the alpha from the image, the two-part shadow that we did, I can plug into the factor. And now you see we're just left with the shadows. Okay, if I turn on my world background again, you can see we've got the shadows on that plane. Right, now the textures are looking a bit hard, shall we say. So maybe we can do something with that. I think what we'll do is we'll go back to our node editor, or not our node editor, our compositor, and we want to blur these up a bit. So I think probably we could have a look for some kind of a blur node, which will be under filter, I guess. Yep, a blur. So we can add a blur in here, and I've never played with a blur node before, so let's see what happens. There we go. If we increase the X and Y, we're starting to blur the edges. So let's give it a bit more blur. Yep. Right, okay, so we can do the same thing again with the viewer node. We see it's blurred here. I could save this out, and I'll save it as my two-part texture again. Right, now if I come back into my node editor, my shader, should be able to reload this image. Let me two-part and image, reload image. But you see, we've lost those hard edges and we're getting much more realistic shadows. So that is how you can bake shadows with a transparency in cycles. It's not actually baking. Well, it is and it isn't. Part of the process is baking, but we then have to go into the compositor to just do a little bit more work on it.